agenda. It's a great pleasure to have our esteemed panelists on board and our participants as well. We look forward to a fruitful conversation, and this conversation came about how Nigeria, as a nation which is being impacted immensely by climate change, how do we go beyond the conversations that have happened at the global level to implementing immediate solutions that would benefit and build a climate resilient future that we have. I'm going to share my slides and give a brief introduction about Clean Technology Hub, as well as running us through basic housekeeping rules before I then hand over to our moderator, who will be introducing the panelists, and then the discussions can continue. We want this to be as interactive as possible. We want contributions from everyone. If you have a question, feel free to put them in the comment section where we'll read it out to our panelists to address them. And you are free to direct your questions to any of the panelists you believe is in the best place to answer your questions. We've got a couple of questions from participants already, and we look forward to having more questions. Thank you. Just a moment, my screen is coming up. All right, while that is coming up, Clean Technology Hub, based here out of Abuja, is a pioneering hybrid hub for the research, development, incubation, and acceleration of clean technologies. We believe that as Africa, a vulnerable continent to the impact of climate change, we need homegrown and local solutions to address some of the problems that we are experiencing. And we can see over our experience has shown us that there are innovations coming up from every part of the country. And we also facilitate the investment of funds into clean energy and climate smart startups. Basically, we work along two sectors: energy access and climate action. Our goal is to see Africa that is powered through clean and renewable energy, and also an Africa that innovates climate resilient solutions to build the desired future that we have. And we do this basically through 5 key areas: advocacy, capacity development, enterprise development and support, policy and advisory, as well as research. We believe that innovating and providing solutions across board and collaborations with our partners will go a long way in achieving the much desired climate resilient future that we want. And welcome once again this morning. We have our esteemed panelists who are willing to share their experience from the just concluded UN Climate Conference in Glasgow. And this conversation would seek to deepen and provide pathways for us to not only decarbonize Nigeria, but also prepare for our 2060 ambition. Thank you and welcome. I will implore all participants to keep their mics muted so we don't interrupt the discussion. Feel free to drop your comments and questions in the chat box. We'll take note of them. And also, the panelists to be taking your questions as well. Now I'll hand over to Dr. Chioma Ewurum, who is going to facilitate and moderate the session. Hello, Chioma.
Hello, Wale. Good morning, everyone. So as Wale mentioned, my name is Dr. Chioma Ewurum. It's a pleasure to be the moderator for this exciting webinar. I am the Manager of Research at Clean Technology Hub. And it's also a pleasure to have our esteemed panelists join us in this very important discussion. So I shall start by introducing them. We have our first panelist, which is Professor Chukwumerije Okereke, who is the director of the Center for Climate Change and Development at Alex Ekwueme Federal University, Undufu Alike, and is also a visiting professor at the University of Reading in the UK. He is a globally recognized leading scholar on global climate governance and international developments with expertise in climate justice, national green growth transition in Africa, climate adaptation, business climate strategies, and also an advisor to governments, corporations, and international institutions. He has served as lead author on major global scientific assessment projects, including the IPCC special reports on 1.5 degree global warming, as well as the 5th assessment reports of the IPCC, and also the United Nations Environment Programme's urbanization, amongst other reports and assessments. So warm welcome to you, Professor Chukwumerije Okereke. It's a pleasure to have you as our panelist. And next we have Dr. Priscilla Achapa, who is the founder and global president of the Women Environmental Programme, which has been in existence for the past 24 years. She has done extensive work advocating for the rights of women and youth on environmental, socio-economic, and political issues. She was the National Coordinator on Water Supply and Sanitation, Collaborative Council, Nigeria, also member of the Women and Gender Constituency at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. As well as, amongst others, she also is a facilitator of the Women Major Group at United Nations Environment Programme. She has received several awards at both national and international level, including Ashoka Fellows, Climate Warrior, Vogue Magazine 2015, and Channels TV Nigeria. Warm welcome to you, Dr. Priscilla Achapa. It's a pleasure to have you here. And our final panelist is Mr. Sean Melbourne, who is the head of climate change and energy for West Africa at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. Before that, he has spent 6 years as the Deputy Head of Missions to Albania and also the Deputy Head of Mission to Zambia. He has worked as Government Relation Advisor for Shell International in the past, and he has been residing in Nigeria since 2019. Warm welcome to you, Mr. Sean Melbourne. It's a pleasure to have all the panelists join us as we discuss very important topics in this webinar. Also, we have our distinguished participants. Warm welcome to Clement Agege. Also have Comfort Asokoro. Warm welcome. We have Elizabeth. We have Funto, Hans, John. Also have Maria. We have Uzoamaka. Warm welcome to all the participants. It's very nice having you guys be part of this important discussion. So without any delay, we shall begin the panel discussion. Before this, I would like to encourage the audience to interact with each other using the chat box. If you have any questions as the panel discussion progresses, please do so. Feel free to ask questions. And if you have any questions that you'd like to be directed to a particular panelist, please indicate the name of the panelist so that when we have the Q&A session, we can direct questions to a particular panelist. So without further ado, I shall begin the panel discussion. So to the panelists, the audience would like to know, and this question is directed to all the panelists. From your perspective, are you satisfied with the outcomes of COP26? Are you pessimistic? Are you optimistic? Are you indifferent? Very briefly, let us know. So we'll start with Professor Okereke. We'd like to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me once more just thank you guys for putting the event, but also to express my pleasure and delight for sharing the panel with distinguished panelists like Sean and Priscilla, both of which, of course, also are my good friends. To the question, contrary to what many have written about the COP, how dismal, how disappointing, how catastrophic the outcome was, I actually have the view that is slightly different from those. And my own personal assessment is that the COP was relatively successful, in my view. Now, I understand the frustration that's been expressed by some people. This is in part because just a little bit, in a sense, there was a bit of a over-promising, over-presentation by the UK government in particular, but a number of other commentators about the COP process. And so that sense of over-presentation, over-promise that it's going to be once in a lifetime opportunity, this is going to be a do or die affair for climate change. This is 1 minute before midnight. All those characterizations led to a sense that then, because we didn't deliver, particularly on the mitigation ambition, but also on the climate change ambition, then that this is a catastrophe. But if you understand COP as a process, okay, then you will begin to appreciate the enormity of what was achieved in COP26. First of all, the fact that the UK government managed to hold the COP despite the pandemic that shook the world and brought it to a standstill in 2020, and relatively kept the COP26 from becoming a super spreading event, I think is a success. Number two, the total emission pledge before COP was around 52.4 gigatons. And the world was on the path for nearly, 2.7 and in some cases 3 degrees warming. And it was the sheer gusto and diplomatic prowess of the UK government that managed to corral many countries to make pledges at COP. And now we have about 41.9 gigatons up until 2030. Of course, this is nowhere where we want to be. And in that sense, there was a big disappointment that the UK government didn't manage to bring the likes of Australia and China and Saudi Arabia to strengthen their commitment. But I still think that if you put that in the context of the World Leaders Summit, proposal to cut methane, to tackle deforestation, and to unlock trillions of dollars from the private sector, then you begin to understand the success that was achieved. The disappointment, of course, was in the finance. Rich countries have had nearly 20 years to mobilize the $100 billion per year promised from 2020 onwards. They failed to do that. They had a lot of time and warning. They didn't manage to do that. And the pathway that was put forward before COP indicates that this money won't be mobilized until 2023, and that's not good enough because this is an issue of trust. Climate change is already happening in many African countries and poor countries, and there is a need to increase the finances to enable them to take more ambitious action. And so I don't want to use the time of other people. I can spend like 3 hours just analyzing different parts of COP. That is not the intention here. Let me just chill, and then I can come back later so that Priscilla, I'm sure will have something to say.
Thank you so much, Prof. Okereke, for your opinions. We'll go next to Dr. Achapa. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to also share my views, and thank you for organizing this forum, which for me is coming very timely. When Professor Chukwumerije speaks, it becomes very difficult for others to say anything because he has like wrapped everything up. However, let me speak from the perspective of the civil society who were mobilizing at the COP26. But also let me congratulate the UK government for working so hard to have a successful COP. It was not easy because in the era of COVID-19, just as Chukwumerije has said, so many things went into planning. And of course, we can understand the frustration of the civil society because most of them felt that they were not in the negotiating room. I've heard complaints where a lot of them say that, I mean, out of the 13,000 or that were there, only about 32 were able to be in the negotiating rooms to at least observe what was happening, which we can understand. I mean, the UK government was actually trying to make sure that at the end of the COP, we don't have emergencies on our hand, which of course we're already having. But by and large, another frustration which the civil society felt that even though some of them felt that the COP26 did not meet their aspirations and the negotiations did not go the way they wanted, like the issues of finance, climate finance, which the developed countries only promised, Chukwumerije has already said it, that those ambitions can only be taken up in 2023, which is not good enough. The issues of fossil fuel came out very strongly, but also in terms of the World Leaders Summit, which a lot of the world leaders made pledges and coming back home, a lot of our people were asking questions that yes, Nigeria has submitted the NDCs, of course, the national adaptation plans and the rest of them. The national policy on climate change is kind of vague when it comes to the issues of financing these NDCs. So yes, Nigeria wants to have a net zero program. How is it going to be financed? Those are some of the questions that were coming on. But for me, negotiating on behalf of Nigeria on gender issues, I felt that to some extent, we have gotten some level of understanding, except that a lot of parties decided to water down the gender aspect of it. Most of the decisions that we arrived at were kind of non-binding. It's just to say parties, countries should encourage. All those words are not binding. So, and it was a very difficult situation to get all the parties to understand that those language were not binding. However, we're able to reach a decision. So I would say yes, the way people felt that COVID-19, I mean, the COP26 was a disappointment. I don't feel it that way. I feel that we were able to achieve some milestone, and which we should be able to leverage on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Achapa, for expressing your views. Next, we'd go to our next panelist, Mr. Sean Melbourne. The floor is yours. What are your views on the outcome of COP26?
Yeah, thank you very much. I concur with what our other panelists have said. I think it's not just COVID, actually. I mean, unfortunately, we're living in an increasingly fractured world. So to convene 38,000 people representing, more than almost 200 countries safely, and then reaching agreement in the form of the Glasgow Climate Pact, I think in itself was a considerable achievement. The professor mentioned about the UK sort of raising expectations with COP26. I think that was actually, I mean, we did risk raising expectations, but I think, we're unapologetic about the UK presidency aiming high, because the science tells us that 1.5 degrees is important, and that every fraction of a degree of warming will result in many more lives lost and livelihoods damaged. So it was no good doing the lowest common denominator, and bending the temperature goals a bit, We really needed to keep 1.5 degrees in sight. And we've just about done that. But 2022 and this coming decade will be the proof of the pudding. I think there were a couple of things around COP26 I was personally pleased to see. One is, we're no longer having that ridiculous circular argument about, well, do humans cause climate change? And the science is clear. 99.9% of people agree that humans are causing climate change, and every single country agrees that. So that argument is no longer around. Secondly, this is the first COP, I think, where nature and biodiversity were properly recognized as being absolutely essential in the fight against climate change. And that was a big focus of our presidency as well. And thirdly, I think, the role of non-state actors, investors, business, cities, regions, civil society in the fight against climate change was elevated to new heights. And, COP26 showcased the vital role that non-state actors in collaboration with the public sector, can play in driving a clean and resilient world. That was showcased for the first time at COP26. And that is, again, really, really critical. This climate change cannot be left to governments alone. We need business, we need civil society, and indeed us as individuals to be all moving in the same direction. So that was pleasing as well. Over.
Thank you so much, Mr. Melbourne, for sharing your viewpoints. So this question is directed to Prof. Okereke. So Nigeria recently updated its nationally determined contributions under the UNFCCC for unconditional mitigation. So the target was 20%, which was set to be achieved by 2030. And the conditional target was slightly increased to 47%. So the audience would like to know, what has been our progress so far in the Nigerian context? Is Nigeria on track to meeting the NDC targets by 2030?
First of all, let us congratulate Nigeria for producing the first NDC even, and more particularly the revised NDC at a time when there was COVID, and they were struggling. I mean, oil price crashed. There was a national lockdown, but also a global pandemic. The number of unemployed people rose astronomically. According to some statistics, about 11 extra million people were going to be sucked into abject poverty. And in all of those, Nigeria still managed to drive a fairly strong NDC revision process, but also got in new gases into the basket, and new sector, particularly waste, but also still promised to ratchet the ambition, or did ratchet the ambition along the lines that you indicated. However, I am sad to report that there remains a huge credibility gap in terms of the implementation. And I speak not necessarily about the revised NDC, because it was only submitted few months ago, but the analysis that we did at the Center for Climate Change and Development at Achapa Federal University indicated that there is a huge gap in terms of the implementation of the previous NDC. We now know, of course, that certain green recovery measures were put into the national COVID recovery plan, especially the 5 million solar panel ambition. But the report that we've done indicates that there's a lot more that can be done. I don't also want us to gloss over the fact that the signing of the climate change bill into law represents, to a large degree, an aspect of the implementation, or at least a framework that may help to facilitate the implementation of the new NDC. But I do think that we are not on track. But I also want to make it clear that this is not only a Nigerian problem. The UK is not on track to deliver its own ambition. Many, many other countries are not on track. So it is wanting to celebrate the new pledges made in Glasgow. And the decision is that, realizing the huge gap that remains and the urgency of the problem, that countries are now encouraged to strengthen their ambition much more regularly, in fact, to come back in 2022. The challenge, however, is that you have to, as a climate scientist and somebody that is very, very deep into policy making on climate change, you sometimes have to wonder what can be achieved in terms of ratcheting of an ambition within 9 months. And even as Peju has just been posting, the implementation of the 5 million solar panel has not really taken off. And I read somewhere a critical journalistic article that it also indicates that the projects that were funded by the Nigerian government under the Green Climate Fund, sorry, the bond, the Green Bond, some of those were actually and still actually are very disastrous. So going forward, we now need to translate this excellent document that, and we want to recognize the presence of Hans Ewurum, who contributed immensely in drafting the revised NDC. But we now need to please pay attention on how to translate these lofty ideas and ambitions into real practical implementation measures. And the first has to be a robust sectoral plans with a clear implementable plans to back them up.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Okereke. That's rather extensive. Does any one of the panel have any differing viewpoints that they would like to share, or you in agreement? Start with them. Dr. Achapa.
Okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
I don't really have a differing voice, but what I want to say is that the NDCs are indeed, the process that brought about the NDCs was indeed very robust. The government went around the country trying to get everybody's voice, including the civil society, the private sector, and of course the youth and the women groups to have their voice and their aspirations to be included in the NDCs. We have a very good NDC documents, which was submitted this year in July precisely. However, the political will for funding these NDCs is something that we really need to look at. And the framework of implementation, it's not just to have an NDCs that is at the national level. What happens to the subnationals? What happens to the local government? How much are they going to buy into these NDCs? Because it's not a document that should be just at the federal level, but it's a document, the implementation of it, the framework for implementation of it should be at the state level. And so it would be nice to see that we have the framework of implementation that cut across all sectors. And I mean, like the subnationals are involved. If you go to the states and begin to talk to the states about the issues of NDCs, national determinant contributions, some of them will ask you, what is that? And when you zero it on climate change, because a lot of them see climate change as an abstract thing, so they don't even understand what you're talking about. So it is important that we have this very important document, but for us to achieve what the document contains, is mean that everybody must be carried along, and everybody must be able to understand why it is important for us to implement the NDCs. Our president has gone to the World Summit and made a pledge. when he made that pledge, the pledge was not just about him, but it's about Nigerians. So how do we bring that to bear on Nigerians when it comes to implementation? And that is where the leadership is very key in trying to ensure that it is not just to have a paper, but this paper translates into actions, implementable actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Achapa. As Professor Okereke mentioned, there is a huge credibility gap. So my next question is in line with the net zero ambition that you just mentioned, Dr. Achapa. How feasible is it then for Nigeria to achieve that net zero target by year 2060? Given that Professor Okereke had mentioned that there's a huge credibility gap that exists, and this question is open to other panelists. Maybe we'll allow Mr. Melbourne to speak on this, and then we'll circle back.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think having a net zero target is important. I think it gives a country, gives our politicians and business and others something to aim for. I think that's really important. It's much better to have a target than some wishy-washy, oh, well, sometime in the second half of the century, we might get to net zero. The way that the science is moving, the speed of climate change means that doesn't really wash anymore. So I think it's commendable. Nigeria has this net zero target. However, we shouldn't be running maybe before we can walk. And I think the relentless focus must be on the nationally determined contribution, which is to 2030. The science tells us that it's this year that is the critical decade. And if Nigeria is not making progress on its NDC, it's probably not going to get anywhere near its 2060 target either. So there must be this, if we're going to shift the dial on climate at all, we need a relentless focus on the key policy issues. And we need to get finance to the places where it's needed most, including the grassroots. Some of the key policy issues I suggest are power sector reform and boosting, as the Prof said, solar home products uptake. And the government can do this by removing customs duties on imported solar products. And we've actually recently published a study which showed not only would removing customs duties significantly increase the uptake of solar home systems, but in the medium term, over 5 years, the Ministry of Finance, the Exchequer, would actually get 5 times more revenue. So it's a real win-win that ought to be implemented. There's also tackling the fuel subsidy as well. It's incredibly wasteful. It's incredibly inefficient. It's a significant drain on the budget, and it's crowding out clean energies and technologies. So that issue isn't just one for Nigeria, but it is very relevant to Nigeria, and that $2 to $3 billion can be spent much more productively elsewhere. I think on the NDC, I think the 2015 one, I'm slightly worried that Nigeria lost 3 or 4 years, quite frankly, although there were some mitigating circumstances given the pandemic and the economic challenges. But I think it's Nigeria's to be highly commended for the 2020 NDC, and it's absolutely, is widely recognised and praised for its ambition. And the key now is implementation. And the UK government and I know our key partners are keen to support Nigeria in realising this ambition. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Melbourne. I'm sorry, Professor Okereke would like to comment. We're about to comment?
Yes, let the 2060 ambition. I think that Sean puts this really perfectly. Let me give you one illustration that may help to bring some concreteness to what Sean and Priscilla were excellently articulating. So at the Center for Climate Change in Dufali, we've done, and with our partners, we've done some modeling. You remember that I'm leading a national project on deep decarbonization, which is funded by the French Development Agency. And what we're trying to do is to provide high fidelity, low emission development pathways, just playing around with numbers and thinking how, how fast can Nigeria decarbonize in a deep way? And what are the implications in terms of the sectoral emission reduction strategies and policies and finance and all of those sorts of things, technology. So we played around with massive reduction of opportunities and potential for household energy. I mean, many people don't understand that in the energy mix or dynamic of Nigeria is actually quite different from the energy dynamics of many industrialized countries, in the sense that nearly 76% of our energy is used at the household level because of our poor industrial state. That has to change, of course, if you want to industrialize more quickly. But and this has many implications in terms of health, but in terms of deforestation, and is a source of binding constraint to economic development. And so we took the household sector for a start, and we modeled energy implications for household sector energy development up to 2040. And we have a business as usual scenario. We have a technology scenario. We have a third scenario that actually combines technology and efficiency. And then we have a sort of transformational scenario where you're actually hoping that you're gonna almost take emissions from the household sector to close to zero as possible. And what we found was that if you take seriously the transformative scenario, which comes closest to the net zero target, even at 2040, it is difficult to imagine a situation where kerosene is playing any role in cooking. It's difficult to imagine where gas is playing any role in household cooking and heating. And this is just assuming a 2.8 or thereabout, percent of population growth and similar economic growth projections. So now, but if you leave that study aside and just look at what the numbers are telling you about where people are saying that Nigeria could be by 2040 in terms of cooking, you will get a considerably different picture, with some projecting about 40 million Nigerians still cooking with hazardous wood and kerosene. So this gives you a little bit, I hope, a sense of our understanding of the huge change or shift that we need to see happen in Nigeria if you're serious about achieving any kind of net zero by 2060. But I'll leave it there so that I don't confuse more people.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Okereke. So in the next 5 minutes, we would take some questions from the audience. So please, if you have any questions, kindly share using the chat box. So this question is for Dr. Achapa. So the National Action Plan on Gender and Climate Change was launched in March 2001, which is this year. What roles can stakeholders play to achieve the objective of this plan? And how does this fit into the 2020 net zero targets?
Thank you very much. How to mainstream women or gender action plan on climate change. We now have a very robust action plan, which covers about 5 sectors: agriculture, forestry and land use, food security and health, energy and transport, waste management, water and sanitation. This is indeed a very robust action plan, in which all the sectors needs to key into. When we talk about gender issues, it's not just about women, but it's about both men and women. And so when the action plan was being developed, the GCC, that is the Department of Climate Change, and in partnership with some of us went around the country trying to get inputs into the action plan. Now the action plan has been developed. What is the next action? Yes, it was launched this year in March, precisely by the Honorable Minister. However, the action plan has, we need a framework of implementation. And this framework of implementation needs to be not just at the national level, as I said earlier, it needs to be targeted also at the subnational. So because it's just to have an action plan or even a policy, but when you have this, the nationals must work with the subnational to make sure that this is implemented, because the issues of action, climate change, the challenges are actually at the subnational and at the local government level, in the communities. So if you don't involve these things, these people in this action plan, there is no way you can achieve the target of 2060. So we need to develop a framework of implementation that comes from the federal to the state to the local government, and where all the stakeholders are involved, the women group, the civil society, the youth, the people with disability, all of them need to be on board to be able to do this. But at the same time, we need to target the state government to also have their own action plan. Like I stated before, most of the times when you go out and you begin to talk to people about climate change, they look at it as an abstract subject or a subject for only the elites. So a lot of people don't understand this. So we need to begin to unpack the jargon that that comes with the issues of climate change, unpack it and communicate it to the rural farmers, to the people at the state level, for them to understand the impact of this. And sometimes it's even good to use scenarios to be able to communicate climate change. But by and large, we need everybody to be on board to be able to do this. And when it comes to the issues of gender, everybody keeps asking, what has gender got to do with climate change? Why are you distinguishing gender from the issues of climate change? The way both men and women experience the impact of climate change is different from different from each other. Even though we know that climate change affects all of us, but the impact of it on the female gender or the people with disabilities or the elderly is quite different when you talk about the people that are abled men or abled women. So it is very important for us to begin to understand this concept. And I give you a typical example. We have a huge challenge on our hand here in the country, the issue of the drying up of rivers, the sea level rise. Some weeks ago, the problem we have in Lagos about the sea level rise, where a whole community has been displaced, and who are the people that are affected most? We have the women and the children that are affected most. Of course, their source of livelihoods is eroded because they have to move. And when they move, the place where they're moving is quite different from where they are. So starting afresh is a big trouble. But also the issues of forced migration is a huge problem that we have there. So it is important for us to begin to understand that climate change affects each and every one of us differently. And the earlier we begin to have strategies and frameworks of addressing this, especially the people at the rural communities, we're talking about the farmers, how do they engage? And that is why when we are developing this framework, the action plan, we look at the issues that are very critical: agriculture, food security, the issues of energy. Is women that will have to trek kilometers away to go and look for firewood to come and cook for the house. So how do we address this issue? So we are looking at it from the part that everybody needs to be on board, if indeed that we have to achieve our targets of 2060. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Achapa. Okay, so now we're going to have our Q&A sessions where the participants can raise their hands if they have any questions for the panelists. I can see some of us have already asked some questions on the chat. Okay, so we have a question from Ola Sukami Akerele. And the question is, considering developed countries' renewed commitments at COP26 towards $100 billion climate finance goal to helping developing countries, is there any plan or implementation strategies embedded in the Nigeria Climate Change Act 2021 for nature-based solutions? For nature-based solutions to reduce carbon emissions and fight climate change? So that question is directed to any of the panelists can go ahead to answer that question. I can see.
Well, yeah,
Okereke is eager, and also Mr. Melbourne. So we'll start with Professor Okereke.
Okay, I'll keep my response very simple and short, and then Sean may be able to elaborate. I led the technical committee that revised the bill, and I can say authoritatively that there is a big section on nature-based solution. But Sean and many others have been pushing for some kind of scale up of nature-based solution, and maybe he can talk about that. But yes, there is a big section on that. But as Priscilla has been excellently stating, writing the document is one thing, getting it implemented is another thing. And although I envisage the National Council to have a big role in interministerial coordination, sending the right political signal, corralling, reporting from various sectors, they will still meet with significant challenges by way of capacity, by way of finance, by way of political will. But in short, there is a big provision for nature-based solution in the Climate Change Act.
Yeah, shall I come in as well? The Prof is being typically modest in his role in getting the climate change bill over the line. I mean, this is a truly groundbreaking piece of legislation. And again, the Nigerian government must be highly commended for progressing this. It's only the second such legislation in Africa. And I think it will stand Nigeria in good stead over the medium to long term to get these investments that we've been talking about into Nigeria. It's something that business and investors in particular look for, that sort of legal certainty. And now we have legislation that should underpin Nigeria's NDC. So the Prof is right in that nature-based solutions provisions are included in the bill. So, for example, there is a reference to the REDD+ registry. There is a reference to natural capital accounts. And the bill also envisages setting annual and 5-yearly carbon budgets. All of these things have the potential to really boost climate action, I think, in Nigeria and mainstream climate and environmental considerations international policy making. I will say one more thing about that bill, or that what is now an act. It also emphasizes the importance of climate change education and a public engagement strategy. That, to me, is so important. And you know, we were talking before about governments doing this and business doing that. Engaging the youth, engaging people at schools, at universities, can make a real difference, I think, in galvanizing climate action. So again, I was really pleased to see this provision on climate change education and public engagement in the plan. So I think that's very good news, but we've got to move into the implementation stage. Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melbourne. Okay, we have one hand raised from Ifeoma Malu. Ifeoma Malu, please, can you kindly unmute your mic and ask your question?
Thank you, Chioma.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. My question goes to Sean. And, you know, it was interesting to hear him link a lot of the climate change issues that we should be sort of framing around energy access. And my question really is, how do we do that? Because these two sectors seem to work in silos, haven't been able to properly integrate the decarbonization issues as a collective goal when we're talking about climate change and decarbonization. So I'm sort of interested in, because we've been struggling with it at Clean Tech Hub. So maybe you have ideas of where this has been done effectively in other climes, and maybe you can share those.
Yeah, well, I don't have a silver bullet, unfortunately. I wish I did. But you know, you only have to revisit Nigeria's NDC to see that 65% of Nigeria's emissions are energy related. So on a mitigation level, solving the conundrum around energy is really, really important. I think there's the macro stuff like power sector reform, which you need the big beasts of development to help with. So the likes of the World Bank, for example. Nigeria has actually made some progress over the last few years reducing gas flaring. Needs to go much further, but some progress is being made, and that needs to accelerate. I think somebody made the really important point earlier about clean cooking as well. Now, so if you're going on a slightly more micro scale, but something that will make a huge difference to people's lives, literally people's lives and their health, and having social economic impact as well as environmental and climate impact. Solving the clean cooking conundrum, which isn't impossible, would go a long way to having positive outcomes for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in Nigeria. If you're looking at the rate of deforestation, despite the best efforts of rangers and others, people won't be cooking from firewood soon, certainly in 2040, because there's just going to be no firewood around. So I think we're coming around again, I think, to the business environment and getting that right. So you get the investments, and it's not just public sector investments. You talked about the 100 billion. 100 billion, it's a drop in the ocean. What we need is some of that 130 trillion mentioned at COP26 from the private sector, and some of that to come into Nigeria. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do that. I think one, the most immediate one, is to finalize that NDC implementation plan, finalize that NDC investment strategy. And if I was, in the Nigerian government, I would then take those documents to somewhere like London Climate Action Week at the end of June, where, the finances of the world, companies are, will convene, and I would sell that plan to the private sector. I would say about how Nigeria is, open to business, open to investments. It's got the Climate Change Act. And I think that is one way where we can get the finance to support the clean energy transition. Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melbourne. Because of time constraints, would like the panelists to keep their answers as concise as possible so that we could at least have the audience have answers to their question. So the next question we have is from Etta Michael, who is from Enviro News. So he said, the professor raised the issue of integrity. How can we achieve the net zero ambition in the face of international insincerity? I guess that question is directed to you, Professor Okereke.
Well, you said to keep answers small. The answer is we cannot achieve the net zero if we are not sincere. But I can elaborate a little bit. There is a lot of pressure for sincerity, and you're going to see much more of those in 2022. And at COP, we already managed to set some kind of process in motion. It doesn't get a lot of, kind of media headlines, but that's what a lot of work done on standardization of formatting for presentation, harmonizing timeframes for submissions, going into more details about what kind of information we want to see from countries as to what they are doing. These sorts of procedural devices may seem very little at the time they are agreed, but over time they will become increasingly important in enhancing transparency. But this is also where Sean's point about public engagement will become important. You will see quite a lot of fireworks coming from civil society actors, especially in the rich countries who really understand the numbers, pushing their countries to make do their pledges. It's already happening in the UK. Just this week, there was a very interesting firework between climate activists and the government about the integrity of the UK pledge and the different policy scenarios and pathways to enhancing transparency and staying on track. Expect to see more of this in 2022.
Thank you very much, Professor Okereke, for your response to that question. So we have a hand raised, Comfort Sokoro. Can you unmute your mic and ask your question?
Thank you very much, Chioma, and good to meet you again, Professor Chukwumerije. Madam Achapa, nice to see you again. My question is very brief and direct. I work as a consultant in Nigeria for a lot of energy-related projects, and Nigeria is still approving coal-fired power plants, even as I speak. How does that marry our net zero ambition? That's my question. Thank you.
You can expect Comfort to ask a hard question. Comfort, good to meet you. That is the challenge. I mean, you remember I talked about the report that was published by my center on the assessment of the extent of implementation of the old NDC, and looking forward to what that might mean to the new NDC. And one of the key points that we made was that there remains a big tension even within the government. If you look at the 2020 vision, but also the ERGP, the Economic Recovery Growth Plan, and even the National Economic and Sustainability Plan, which is sort of the post-COVID. Sorry, I forgot to switch on my list, which is the post-COVID recovery plan. All of these crucial macroeconomic documents make it clear that Nigeria is still interested in expanding its investment in fossil fuel. The Petroleum Industry Act that was signed, for all the greatness of that act, you can see that the emphasis is on rewarding more exploration, with a nearly 30% of proceeds going to frontiers exploration. This does not tally with the idea of a net zero by 2060. I am not saying here that Nigeria should leave all its oil on the ground. There may well still be a role for oil, and especially in the area of petrochemical, but the transition also has to be just and well sequenced. But at the moment, the two numbers are not squaring up, and that is a big problem.
Thank you very much, Professor Okereke. So have one hand raised, or rather several, but I will just select one. I believe
Sean has raised his hand. I think
yes,
he should be allowed to come in.
Yeah. Yes, Sean, I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, no, I think energy transition and energy access is really it's central, isn't it, to Nigeria's national development, and not just its making progress on climate and environmental issues. It's really, really central. I think maybe one of the things that went slightly under the radar at COP26 was this deal that South Africa got 8.5 billion, that's quite a big number, to phase out, not just phase down, its coal-fired power. And that is, I think, being used by the international community and donors as a sort of test case on on how we can successfully phase out fossil fuels. I think the focus for the immediate future will be on coal, if that program works out, as I hope it will. But then there will be an increasing focus, I think, on the other fossil fuels. And as the professor said, having a just transition, because we can't sort of point fingers and say, well, you can't use oil and gas anymore. You need to give countries options and alternatives, and the workers in those industries need to also be supported. And there's increasing focus on this, and I think this will be a focus at COP27 and beyond that as well. So let's see how the South Africa deal goes. Let's see if coal really is phased out and renewables come much more onto the grid. But that could be a really good test case to replicate in other countries where hydrocarbons are still a big part of the economy. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. So we would take 2 more questions because of the time constraints we have. I'll take one more person from the participant, Mr. John Akinuba. You have your hands raised. Kindly unmute your mic and ask your question.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think my name is John Akinuba of Center for Ecological and Community Development. I've been showing interest in Dr. Okereke's publications, which we share on email, and most time I used to make mention the difference between industrial issue and core issue that has to do with mitigation factors in Nigeria. In the sub-Saharan region, where we have much emission problem is the issue of land use, which is more pronounced in agriculture, forestry, and land use. In our NDC, if you look at the NDC, the energy is taking about 60%, while the remaining other area. So the investors look at this as a core area where they want to invest if they are dealing with the country. I was in Ghana and I was talking to an organization. One of the first things he did was to go into Nigeria's NDC. What is the allocation to the issue of forestry? So in the forestry sector, you have a lot of people that are depending on land, in terms of agriculture, in terms of other related issues. I think the energy issue and the industry, take it for instance, the gas.
Because of time, Mr. John, please, what's your question?
Issues that we're supposed to teach other.
Mr. John, can you hear me?
The question is, how we
Mr. John, you are muted.
Okay, well, shall I answer the question?
How do we?
Okay, there seems to be a lag there.
So let me just ask the last question. How do we make our implementation of any countries around us? We have the Congo-based development program. We have a lot of international clusters of countries coming together to form a kind of financial base to implement a land-based program. But we don't have such in Nigeria. They have work, but the funding and the arrangement were not grounded. These are the area where we are looking at in the implementation of the NDC. How do we focus into all this area in the implementation of the NDC? That is my question.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. John. Okay, the floor is open to anyone of our panelists who wants to answer the question.
I can quickly answer the question if you like. John is quite right to point out the role of agriculture. For two reasons. One is agriculture does actually produce a lot of emissions, especially non-climate smart agriculture. Secondly, around 70% of Nigeria's population are dependent on climate, dependent resources such as agriculture and agroforestry. There is a lot happening. So the UK, for example, is investing in climate resilient rice, which also emits less methane than just normal rice. So that is one way we can make some progress. I think we're also supporting sustainable cocoa, which can help protect also the national parks and also bush mango. So that's supporting local farmers. So instead of sort of chopping down trees for new agricultural lands, they're intensifying their production on existing agricultural land, which has surely got to be a good thing. But what we need to do, of course, is scale all this up. So Nigeria gets the food security that is so important without damaging the climate and damaging the environment. So John raised a really good point there. Over.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chauvin. Well done. Thank you very much, John, for your question. We're going to take one more last question from the chat box. And we have an Etta Michael. This question is, how can all these highly ambitious targets be met in the absence of adequate finance and integrity gaps from international communities? So we have a question from Michael. So that's our final question. The floor is open to any of the panelists to answer.
I think that Professor Okereke has already responded to that question. Talking about the issues of, and he gave example of what is happening in the UK already, where there's a huge mobilization around the issues of the developed countries living up to their promises or delivering on finances. But also, that is where the role of the civil society comes in very handy, because as civil society organizations, we bridge that gap to try to make sure that the issues of the integrity questions by monitoring what is going on and holding the parties accountable to it is critical. So for me, I strongly believe that every one of us has a role to play when you're talking about the issues of integrity in terms of delivering on climate finance. Each and every one of us have a role to play. As civil society organizations, as government, as private sector, we all need to work together to ensure that we deliver on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Achapa. All right, so we have come to the end of this panel discussion. Indeed, it has been a very great session. I have learned a lot, the others have learned a lot and gained a lot of insight into COP26 and beyond COP26 and the future for Nigeria towards achieving net zero emission. So thank you very much to our esteemed panelists and also our distinguished participants for making this webinar as interactive and interesting as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mr. Darafon Bassi, who is going to give a closing remark for this webinar. Thank you. Mr. Darafon, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Thank you, Chioma. And on behalf of Technology Hub, once a big thank you to all our panelists today, Mr. Melbourne, Mrs. Achapa, and for everyone else that's joining in and the discussion that we've gotten today. I believe what we've gotten today, we have identified the actual steps that we can use to carry discussion forward and ensure that Nigeria meets its target of net zero by 2060 before that. So no, thank you everyone for joining this this discussion, and have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
And Chioma, thank you for excellent moderation. Really well done.
It's a pleasure.
Fantastic. Well done. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Have a lovely day.
Everyone.